After inspecting the body, there weren't really any mold lines that needed to be removed, so I could just straight away start on scribing out the panel lines, making them a bit deeper so they don't just bury with paint after applying a couple of layers, and they still keep their nice form and keep the detail on the body highly visible. The panel lines are nicely scribed out and deep enough for a couple of layers of paint to go on top of it. Now the rest of the body of course needs to be prepped as well, so I just took out my 400 grit sanding sponge and started scuffing up the entire body. Now since this is resin, it's a bit harder and therefore I'm using a rougher grit sandpaper. If this was a plastic body, I would just use the regular 600 grit. After scribing and sanding, the dust was removed from the body, set on the Tamiya spray stand. I have links to those products in the description down below, and of course then I could move on to the first couple layers of primer. The first coat of primer went on nicely. I didn't really notice any defects, so I could just move on to letting it cure for about 5 minutes and then moving on to the second and final layer of primer. With that second really thick layer applied, I let it sit and cure for about 45 minutes before moving on to sanding down the entire body with 3000 grit sanding sponges. This is to remove some of the dust that might have fallen into it and also just to smoothen out the primer layer as much as I can before I apply the color coats. I was debating with myself and some of my Patreon supporters over on Patreon whether I should go with a yellow or a blue. And in this case I decided to go with blue since the last build I did on that Honda I already used a yellow, so I figured not to do two yellow builds after each other and to go with the blue instead. Now of course I'm just starting with those hard to reach, easy to forget spots first, and then a light couple coats on the rest of the body. The blue was covering really well, and I noticed quickly the more coats you apply, the darker the blue will turn out, so I still had a long way to go. After applying the first coat, I let it sit for about 10 minutes to dry, then moved on to a second coat, just as light as the first, as I don't really want to overload the body with a lot of paint. With the second coat on, you can already start to see the color being a lot darker than the first coat, so a third coat of course followed as well. After the third coat, I was pretty happy with the way the color is turning out, but just to be sure, I added a fourth and final coat. Now with the body being resin, I can apply a coat a little heavier than I could if it's plastic, as it doesn't really attack the resin at all, and it can lay down a lot smoother with one of those thicker coats being applied. Now like I said, the body isn't plastic. If it was a plastic body, do not apply coats this thick, as it will eat into the body and ruin the finish of your build. So I'm doing this with resin as I can, and as I mentioned, not on a plastic body, so be aware of that. I of course needed to apply a couple of decals as well. There are a couple different variations of stripes included in the kit, and I decided to go with this one. Firstly, I placed the big one on the rear, and then of course the smaller one on the front as well, and added a couple of additional logos on the sides and one on the front for the Ferrari badges. After applying all of the decals, I was happy with the way they laid down, and I could move on to letting that cure for a bit and apply the clear coat a couple hours later. I'm just applying a light first coat, not really going for a smooth finish, just a general coverage on all of the decals and those hard to reach, easy to forget spots. In the second coat, I will add it a bit thicker to start smoothing it out a bit more, and in the third and final coat, I will go for the absolute perfect finish, or at least as best as I can get it. So as you can see, there is still a lot of orange peel in this first coat of clear, and that is completely fine. Everything is nicely covered and sealed up, and in the second coat, with about 5 minutes of cure time in between, I can start fixing that with adding a bit thicker of a coat of clear to start smoothing it out. Now again, just after the first coat, the second coat, it's not perfect either. Still a lot of orange peel visible, and that will be fixed in this third and final coat. This is applied a lot heavier, and it's also meant to just smoothen it out and really get a nice shiny finish on the rest of the body. The third and final coat of clear is on. Time to check my work and then set it aside to let it cure and move on to the next stage for the next video.